In this session, we're going to talk about the history of Christianity or the Christian movement. Now, I need to say, as we talk about this, that what we're going to do in the next maybe 40 minutes or so is what is the same ground that's covered during 16 weeks in a regular semester in our History of Christianity class. So I want to say that to give you a little bit of perspective on how much we're running across the very tip of the surface as far as the history of Christianity. But this will give you some idea of where a few of the major streams within Christianity came from and the major groups within Christianity came from. But please know, this is not near inclusive of all that we could talk about. But if you find this interesting and you want to dig in deeper, we do have a 300 level class that would allow you to do that in our department here at Missouri State. So we talked in the last session about the life of Jesus, but it was really after Jesus that this movement took off and eventually was given the name Christianity or the Christian movement. Again, as I alluded to at least in the previous lecture, those who followed Jesus, as far as we know, were not called Christians during his lifetime. And it seems it was closer to the middle of the first century before that distinction was made. The vast majority of the early Christians were actually Jews, and they tended to stay within the Jewish community and operate within the Jewish community while also taking on this new theology of God and the Messiah that this new movement presented as a result of the life and the claims of resurrection of Jesus. So most of the first Christians were actually called Jews. It's just that they, again, started looking at their Judaism differently, looking at the theology of the Messiah differently, and even of the sacrifice. And so it was later in the first century that they actually were called Christians, and it began to see as a more distinct, and it began to be seen as a more distinct movement. So let me talk about, I'm going to talk about kind of 3 or 4 centuries and the significant things that happened in those centuries in relation to Christianity. So first of all, in the first century, we have the life of Jesus in the early part of the first century. We have the distinctiveness of this movement beginning to take form in the middle of the first century, and those who are part of that movement beginning to be called Christians or Christ followers. But Christianity throughout the remainder of the first century and into the second and third centuries continued to spread even after the death of Jesus. And there's, some people say it was because of the claims of the resurrection that kind of reinvigorated the movement, even though he had been executed. But the movement continued. And there's probably 2 main aspects or 2 main dynamics that caused the spread of Christianity beyond the life of Jesus. One of those was persecution, particularly persecution of Christians. Now, obviously, that's a kind of a counter idea of what should happen, because the purpose of persecution is to squelch and kill a movement. But that's not what happened during the first century. Most of the early Christians were in Jerusalem. They're that first generation of Christians. And so when the persecution by Rome began against Jews and Christians there in the first century, that persecution started in Jerusalem, where all these first Christians were. And so what the result was of that persecution in Jerusalem is that many of those first generation Christians left Jerusalem and began moving to other parts of the empire. And basically, wherever they went, they carried with them this message about the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, and this sort of reinterpreted theology out of Judaism, wherever they went. And then they would go somewhere else, and then the persecutions often would follow them to those areas. And so they'd move again to another area. And so despite the efforts to stop the movement through persecution, what the persecution actually did was enable the movement of Christianity in ways that it might not have moved so early on. It might have stayed more confined in that area. So initially, the persecution of the Christians enabled the spread of it. Secondly, missionaries enabled the spread of Christianity. Christianity is a missionary movement. It's an evangelistic movement. It's been that from day one, really, or as it evolved in those early stages. And so early on, groups of Christians sent out people to other parts of the empire with, again, this message about Jesus, his life, his death, his burial, and the significance of his death and resurrection. Certainly the most famous of those missionaries, and probably the one who had the most significant impact, would be Paul, who's attributed with writing a lot of that second half of the New Testament. In the New Testament, as we said earlier, you have the Gospels, which are interpretations of Jesus' life, but then the last half is largely letters from various church leaders to different churches or different regions where there were churches in the first century. And Paul wrote a lot of those letters to churches that maybe he had helped start, with churches that protégés of his had started, and so he was also writing letters to encourage them. But most of the second part of the New Testament are these letters that he wrote to these newly found churches. Now, I want to make sure we understand here, too, that when I say church, you probably have a distinct image come to your mind. I do. It's a building with a steeple on top. But what we find in these early centuries of Christianity is that wasn't, when we talked about churches, they didn't meet in buildings like that. They tended to be groups that met in homes, or they might have met in public places that they were able to find an arena to meet. Even in that first century, sometimes in the temple, or in other synagogues that started. So these churches were groups that primarily met in people's homes or other public buildings. There weren't, to refer to church was to refer to a group of people that gathered. It was not to refer to a particular building where a group gathered. And I mention that because that takes a different form here within a few centuries. So Christianity spread through persecution of the Christians and through missionaries like Paul throughout the remainder of the first century and into the second century. And actually, persecutions became more intense throughout the second century and into the early part of the third century. But even that, I think, caused some draw to the movement, because often these persecuted Christians were made spectacles. But in so doing, there's something about the draw of a martyr to a movement. And that also probably had some positive effect on the strength of the movement, even as many Christians were being persecuted and killed. So you've got this movement that continued from the first century into the third century. Persecution of the movement continued to intensify in the second and third centuries. But then in the fourth century, it takes a different turn. And what happens in the fourth century is there's an emperor that comes into power named Constantine. And Constantine, during the time of his rule, and in the early part of his rule, he stopped the persecution of Christians. And by the later part of his rule in the fourth century, he actually made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So Christianity went from the persecuted movement of the empire in the third century to, by the end of the fourth century, being at a minimum the preferred and at most the official religion of the empire. Now, there's a lot of reasons that historians have given to why Constantine might have done this. For our purposes, I'll mention two. One reason may have been a more personal reason, and one reason may have been a more political reason. And as I think is often the case in life, it was probably not one of those solely, but it may have been a combination of those, because things aren't so simple as to be about one reason typically. But on a personal level, during the time of his rule, Constantine claimed that he had a conversion experience where he became a Christian. I mean, basically, he prayed about a battle and made a bargain with God. And God seemed to come through in that bargain. And so the result was that Constantine gave his allegiance to Christianity. And so he claimed that as his own personal faith. Thus, maybe he made Christianity the official religion of the empire because that was his faith that he had given allegiance to. On a political front, when Constantine came into power, to some extent just because of the transition of power, but also because the state of the empire at that point, there was a need to give some stability to the empire. And maybe it's kind of like that idea that, that Martin Luther King talked about, that the best way to get rid of an enemy is to make them your friend. And so if there's this kind of grassroots movement that is always kind of the thorn in the side of the empire, but it just won't die. I mean, it's been 300 years now, and they can't kill it. So if you make that movement your friend, or you make it a friend of yours, then it's no longer an enemy and a thorn in the side to the government. Also, the teachings of Christianity were teachings that actually would benefit a government trying to gain stability. Because if people were to give allegiance to Christianity, then they were also expected to follow the teachings of Christianity that said things like, obey your governing authorities because they're agents of God. Pay your taxes. Live at peace with all people as far as it depends on you. Well, those are good maxims to build a cohesiveness within an empire. So for whatever reasons, and again, I would speculate a combination of the personal and the political, Constantine made religion, the Christian religion, the preferred religion of the empire. And so at that point, that enabled Christianity to pretty much spread into all the cracks and crevices of the empire during this time, this 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. And so what you have from the 4th century up to the 10th, 11th centuries is Christianity permeating through the empire and basically becoming sort of the civil religion or the cultural religion of the empire. That to be Roman was to be Christian. That those were linked hand in hand. Well, then we come to the 11th century. And by the time you get to the 11th century, where you have Christianity spread throughout the empire, several things begin to happen where there becomes to be some obvious differences between Christianity in the western part of the empire and Christianity in the eastern part of the empire. And, you know, again, it's always hard, I think it's hard for us to imagine because, you know, this is an era where they didn't have the communications that we have. They didn't have television, they didn't have radio, they didn't have email, they didn't have phones, all the means of communication. But every once in a while, some of these Christians from the West would cross paths with some of these Christians from the East. And when those crossing of paths would happen, what was obvious looked a lot different in the East and in the West. That there were some basics that were still very true and very there and very present and very shared, but there was also a very distinctive type of Christianity that was developing in the West and developing in the East. Also, what you have in the West is that Rome was becoming a more and more centralized point for the Christian movement throughout the empire. One, because obviously it was the capital of the empire, but the religious leaders in Rome also kind of took on a leadership of Christianity throughout the empire, much like the emperor in Rome carried out leadership throughout the empire on a political level. And so you had people way down in Rome, over there in the West, maybe making decisions, maybe deciding how money should be spent, maybe issuing edicts about doctrine that were expected to be followed by people in Turkey, way off to the east. And so what eventually happened, and this, you know, this is far more complicated, and there's far more issues than what we're going to talk about here in these next few minutes. But basically what happened in the 11th century was there was a split in Christianity, East and West. And again, there was a lot of issues involved in that split. I'll just mention two kind of broad strokes. One of those was human authority in the church, and another issue was just church doctrine. As far as human authority, by this point, the Western church had come to place highest human authority in one person in Rome, the Bishop of Rome. whose title is Pope. And so highest human authority was in an individual, central in Rome, and then there was a hierarchy that filtered out from that individual. Well, in Eastern Europe, or in the eastern part of the empire, there was a desire for a more representative type government. I mean, that was kind of a drive in them because they didn't feel represented at all in Rome. And so what they instituted was a representative council of bishops, that there wasn't just one high bishop in one place, as you find in the Western Church, but that there were several bishops that represented various areas throughout the East, and they would come together and make decisions about church policy, church doctrine, edicts for the church, kind of keep the church on track, the churches on track throughout the East. And so what you have then is this one church that's centered in Rome, and so the distinctive name given to it was the Roman Catholic Church in the West. And you have these other churches in the East that distinguish themselves by the name of the Eastern Orthodox churches. And that's the first major split that you have then in Christianity between the two. Because over for one reason, authority, human authority in the church. A second reason was about doctrine. When you looked at the Eastern churches or the Western churches, from my understanding, they both had the same basic beliefs and the same practice of sacraments. They both accepted the same sacraments in the church, but you could go down the line and, for instance, with the sacraments, you could go down the line, and with each sacrament, even though they both accepted baptism, or they both accepted confirmation, or they both accepted last rites, or extreme unction, they had different ideas about those, why they should be practiced, how they should be practiced. So, for instance, as far as baptism, in the Western churches, centered there in Rome, by this point, for one thing, they were baptizing infants. And this came out of the doctrine of original sin, that when humans are born, original sin teaches that we're born sinful. And especially because there was a high infant mortality rate, there was a need to figure out what to do about these, not to be mean and crude, but these sinful little children who were born, and many of them were dying before they reached an age where they could choose to be baptized, or where their families would choose to baptize them. And so they began baptizing infants through things like sprinkling. Or as other people were dying in battles or whatever, and they wanted to make sure that they were secured of salvation, and they couldn't immerse them in water, they would pour water over them. And so it became, over time, acceptable practice to immerse adults into baptism, into the church, but also to sprinkle them with water or to pour water over them. And so there were different forms of baptism, and there was baptism not only of adults but also of infants. Well, in the Eastern Church, there was only the practice of adult baptism. There wasn't the practice of infant baptism. And the only form of baptism was by immersion. As a matter of fact, the immersion in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox churches, was basically a triple immersion. Because the New Testament says that when one is baptized, they're baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so in the Eastern churches, when they would immerse, and still today when they immerse, it's a triple dunking in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If you've seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, there's a scene there where a young man converts to Orthodoxy. That's the churches that we're talking about here. And he goes, and as an adult, he is immersed. And if you remember that scene, you know, he's dunked in the water, and he comes up, and he thinks he's done, and then the priest takes him and dunks him in again, and there's this triple dunk that happens. So just as far as and there would be other matters related to baptism, but just as far as baptism, who's baptized, why they're baptized, and how they're baptized differed in the East and the West. And that's just one small area of difference, but you could go through every sacrament and find those kinds and even more differences. So because of human authority and because of church doctrine, you have the split, East and West, in the 11th century. And so you have your Eastern Orthodox churches and you have your Roman Catholic Church over in the West. Well, those movements continue to develop throughout time. And eventually you get to the 16th century, another century where a major split, a major event happened in the history of Christianity. And by the time you get to the 16th century, the focus of this is primarily in Western Europe and some in Central Europe. And it's about the Catholic Church. And what you have in the Middle Ages in the Roman Catholic Church there in Europe is, for one thing, you have a real unity between the government and the churches. And so they're both kind of scratching one another's backs and trying to benefit each other here in power and in holding power. And there also seemed to be corruption as far as money in the churches and the use of money in the churches. I mean, if you look, say, in Germany, people were poor and in many ways growing poorer. And yet it appeared the churches were pretty wealthy and growing in wealth. If you've gone to Europe and you've toured Europe, of course what you tour is primarily cathedrals. And most of those elaborate cathedrals with gold and silver and elaborate stained glass and carvings were built in the early Middle Ages and into the Middle Ages out of this money that churches were gaining. And so that caused some people by 16th century, 15th, 16th century to start going, is this right? Is there some arm of corruption within the church? And one of those to first shine the light most brightly on that was a man named Martin Luther. Luther was a monk and a famous teacher in the Catholic Church in Germany. And he began having these questions about this corruption that seemed to be within the church. And so basically he made a list of the things that he thought were issues within the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. And he took this list, and it was a list of 95 things. It's called the 95 Theses for Debate. And he nailed these to the church door there in Wittenberg, Germany in October of 1517, and started he was kind of this point of the spear, what we call the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation was a movement that opposed the authority and the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. So Luther raised this issue, but he wasn't the only one. There were other reformers throughout Europe during this time. Some of you may be familiar with people like John Calvin or Zwingli. These are people in other parts of Europe who were asking a lot of the same questions that Luther was asking. But Luther was certainly, again, the tip of the spear in all of this. So what I would say is the primary initiator of the Protestant Reformation, but certainly not the only initiate of this movement. So Luther raised these 95 issues, and he nailed them to the church door. Well, even though there's 95 points that he makes, there's a few things that those 95 points are just coming at a lot of different directions. I mean, there's a practice called the selling of indulgences. And probably at least half of those 95 theses relate to this practice of the selling of indulgences. And basically the idea of this practice was when someone would go to a priest and make a confession for sin, not only would the priest tell them certain prayers to pray or certain numbers of Hail Marys or certain religious ritual to do for their forgiveness or the penance of their sin, but also they would ask them kind of to put their money where their mouth is and make an offering to the church to show that they really were sorry for this, and it's kind of their sacrifice that they would give to the church. But over time, those offerings kind of became legislated. And so certain sins had certain monetary values attached to them. And it even became where people could, in a sense, pay ahead for forgiveness for sin. And largely that was because of a king who wanted to get a divorce. And he was afraid that when he was at the courthouse getting a divorce, and then when he would cross the street to go to the church to go to confession for getting his divorce, that something might happen to him in that time period, and he might lose his salvation. And so he went to the priest and got the priest basically to absolve him of the sin ahead of time. Maybe you've heard of premeditated sin. That's kind of the idea of that. Those cost more, but you could purchase indulgences for that. You could purchase indulgences for others who had died, but you weren't sure about where they were as far as their salvation. And so you could go to the priest and you could pay an indulgence or purchase an indulgence for an uncle who had died, who you wanted to make sure didn't end up in hell. And so what you have is the church getting richer and richer from this practice, building these nice cathedrals, and the people getting poorer and poorer as a result of this practice. And so Luther, many of his theses for debate revolved around this practice. So basically he attacked the economic structure of the church, and that didn't fly well. He attacked the authority structure of the church. He talked about the role of priest in many of these theses for debate. And his assertion was that every Christian is a priest, and that no Christian has a more unique access to God than another Christian. And that people can go directly to God for forgiveness. They don't have to go through a priest to receive forgiveness. So now he started dismantling the authority structure of the church. Now, another one of his issues that wasn't so highlighted in the theses, but that paralleled all this going on, was that Luther also believed that the Bible should be translated into the language of the people. I mean, up to the 16th century, if someone was a Christian and they wanted to read the Bible for themselves, they had to be able to read either the original biblical languages of Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, or they had to know Latin. There were no other translations of the Bible, and those were at minimum discouraged and at maximum forbidden by the church in different areas throughout Europe as far as translations. And so basically, if people understood what the Bible said, they understood that because the church told them that's what the Bible said. So Luther said we need to translate the we need to translate the Bible into the language of the people. And so he did that. He translated the Bible into German, and this new invention of the printing press put that right to work, distributing copies of this. Well, others started doing that throughout Europe and translating it into English or translating it into Spanish or other language. And some of those early translators actually were people who through the inquisitions of the church of the Middle Ages, lost their lives or were imprisoned for doing that. But he was also asserting giving the scriptures to the people to read and interpret for themselves. Well, this took away some of the control of the church. And so the result of his trying to dismantle the power structure, of taking away some of the control, and of attacking the economic structure of the church, the result was that Luther was excommunicated from the church. He was kicked out of the church. But the result of that is that he was known. And also, he distributed a lot of material about his ideas. Again, this new invention of the printing press enabled that. And so people began latching on to the things that Luther was saying. And those people were called protesters of the church. Eventually, Protestants. And that's where Protestant comes from, is those who protested the authority and teaching of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And so Luther started this other movement that came, again, were protesters of the church, eventually called the Protestants, and that came out of the Protestant Reformation. And so you have these three big umbrella areas that came out of Christianity. You've got the Orthodox churches that distinguished themselves in the 11th century, and then you've got the Protestant churches that distinguished themselves in the 16th century, and then you have the Roman Catholic Church. And really about anything that you would find that we would call part of the Christian movement or part of Christianity has come from one of those three movements. Now, it may have distinguished itself eventually from one of those three movements, But those are the three, well, I think of them as the three umbrellas that you find of Christianity, and everything that's in Christianity would fall under one of those umbrellas, some more tightly than others. But that's where the three major movements came from within Christianity, or from these three base movements of the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Protestant Reformation, and the Roman Catholic Church. So that's not a lot of deep, sometimes people say, well, okay, so what about the Baptists, and what about the Methodists, and what about, well, we have a class in our department, Religion 131, Religion in America, that does more tracing of some of those specific denominations and how they came to the U.S., what they evolved out of in the U.S., where they originated in Europe. And so that class goes into more detail on these denominations within, primarily within Protestantism. That's where you find your denominations because of that freedom to interpret Scripture. What that enabled then were all these different, I believe there's over 350 different Protestant denominations as a result of this freedom given in the Protestant movement to interpret Scripture for yourself. And that's a whirlwind history of Christianity.